They told her she was born second, and that meant she didn't matter. But she was the one who could set fire to a room just by walking into it. Behind the palace gates, she wore diamonds and duty like a second skin, but inside, she was breaking, bleeding, begging for one thing the crown could never give her: love, real love. And when she finally found it, they told her she couldn't have it. Not if she wanted to stay royal, not if she wanted to stay respected, not if she wanted to stay. Before we begin, don't forget to subscribe to The Untold Woman, where the stories they buried finally rise. It started with a glance, barely a moment. A man in uniform standing behind the Queen. He was polished, older, calm. She was young, electric, and waiting for someone to see her. Not the tiara, not the title. Her. He did. Peter Townsend saw through the jewels, through the shadows of her perfect sister, through the lies of royal perfection, and for once, Margaret didn't feel like a spare. She felt chosen. But Buckingham Palace has rules. And those rules weren't written for love. They were written for loyalty, for optics, for control. Margaret knew what they would say. He's divorced. He's too old. It's improper. But she didn't care. She was 22, with fire in her veins and rebellion in her heart. And in Peter's eyes, she saw something she hadn't seen since childhood: truth. He didn't flinch when she spoke back. He didn't bow when she got angry. He listened, and that terrified the palace more than any scandal ever could. Because a royal woman in love is a danger to the throne. They reassigned him, far away, a royal tactic as old as the crown itself: divide to destroy. Send him overseas. Let distance do the dirty work. Let time kill the story. But what they didn't realize was that love doesn't fade in exile. It grows teeth. Margaret wrote letters, long, aching confessions tucked between official schedules and ceremonial gowns. Peter read every word like scripture. Their bond didn't wither, it sharpened. And the more the palace pulled, the more they clung to each other, until it became impossible to hide. They wanted to marry. She was ready. He was desperate. But the law said no, not unless she gave it all up: her royal income, her title, her place in the line of succession, everything. The Queen, her own sister, offered no rescue. Duty, Elizabeth said, must come first, always, even before the heart. For weeks, Margaret disappeared. No cameras, no events, just silence. And when she re-emerged, standing on the steps of Clarence House, the cameras swarmed like vultures. Her voice trembled, just slightly. But the words were polished, cold. I have decided not to marry Group Captain Peter Townsend. She said it was her own decision, that she had considered the church's position, the country's, her role. But her eyes told another story. They screamed. Behind closed doors, Peter was already gone, transferred, cut off. She never saw him again. And something in her snapped. The girl who once giggled in ballrooms, who lit up rooms like chandeliers, began to darken. She drank, smoked, laughed too loudly, kissed men who didn't deserve her just to feel something, anything. They called her difficult, temperamental, unstable. But no one called her broken, because royals don't break. They fracture in silence. In the years that followed, Margaret became a shadow queen, always nearby, never central. A contrast to her sister's stillness, her sister's control. Margaret was movement, heat, fury. But inside, still the same girl on the palace steps, still waiting for someone to choose her. She married a man who didn't love her the way Peter did. Tony Armstrong-Jones was charming, creative, intoxicating, and cruel in all the quiet ways that don't leave bruises, but destroy you just the same. Their wedding was a performance, their honeymoon, a retreat, and the years that followed, a war of icy glances and empty rooms. But Margaret smiled for the cameras, always, until the day she stopped. One morning, years later, a maid found her sitting in silence. The phone was off the hook. Her eyes were vacant. A half-burnt letter sat in the ashtray. only one name legible in the scorched paper: Peter. And Margaret, she was haunted. Even in her final years, when her health failed, when her body gave out before her spirit did, she still held on to something. A silence, a regret, a ghost. They gave her a royal funeral, flags, trumpets, tradition, but the girl who died wasn't royalty. She was a woman who gave up everything for nothing. Because love in her world was a crime. The lies the palace buried start to surface. Not all of them survived. They said she recovered, that after Peter Townsend, she moved on, married, had children, laughed again. But they didn't see the way she stared out windows longer than necessary. How she paused before reading a letter. How she flinched when someone touched her too gently, as if reminding her what tenderness used to feel like. Margaret never truly healed. She adapted, like all royals do. Tony was her crown without a throne. A man the palace approved of because he didn't threaten them. He was an artist, a photographer, a creative storm, and at first it felt like rebellion disguised as tradition. He wasn't royal, he wasn't proper, but he was available, and after Peter, that was enough. The wedding was dazzling, glamour soaked in tradition. The cameras flashed. The public adored her again. Margaret looked radiant, but her smile didn't quite reach her eyes. Not like before. There was no fire behind it. Only reflection. She wasn't marrying for love this time. She was marrying to erase the ache. But the ache didn't leave. It just went quiet. Until she couldn't set. Late one night, Margaret found a letter. Not hers, not addressed to her. Tucked between Tony's camera lenses. It wasn't the words that crushed her. It was the handwriting. Feminine, intimate, familiar. The betrayal wasn't new. It was just louder now, more brazen. He didn't even try to hide it. But Margaret, she stayed. Because a royal woman doesn't walk away. Not first, not publicly. Instead, she began crafting her own revenge. Affairs, escapes, weekends on Mystique with men who adored her simply because she was Margaret, not her Royal Highness, just Margaret. They poured her drinks, played her music, touched her hands without fear. She bathed in recklessness, laughed too loud, smoked too much, let her sadness turn to glitter and ash. And the press? They devoured it. Photos of her dancing barefoot at island parties, of her draped across sunbeds with younger men, of her walking into nightclubs at dawn. The tabloids loved her again, but not the way she needed, not the way Peter had. They loved the spectacle, not the soul. Meanwhile, Tony disappeared further into his own world. He had affairs, so did she, but hers were scrutinized. His were excused. He was eccentric. She was unstable. He was creative. She was falling apart. They had 2 children, a boy and a girl, and for a while Margaret tried to become someone else. A mother who didn't scream, a wife who didn't drink too much, a princess who didn't tremble at the thought of being forgotten. But shadows don't vanish, they stretch. One night, after a particularly brutal argument, Tony left for good. There was no dramatic exit, just silence. Margaret stood in the hallway, her hand still on the doorknob, as if expecting him to turn back. He didn't. And for the first time in decades, Margaret was truly alone. The palace spun it like a tragedy. They crafted statements, curated sympathy. But Margaret knew better. She wasn't a victim in their eyes. She was a problem they'd tolerated for too long. And so they froze her out. Less appearances, fewer invitations. The Queen, always composed, never cruel, kept her distance, not out of malice. Out of duty. That same cold duty that had once torn Margaret and Peter apart now quietly erased her from the royal frame. She was still in the photographs, but always off to the side. She tried to laugh it off, told friends she preferred it that way, that she hated the attention anyway. But the truth clung to her in mirrors, in half-finished letters, in the way her name stopped being whispered with wonder and started being whispered with pity. Years passed. Margaret aged but never softened. The fire in her dimmed, but it never died. She still smoked like royalty, drank like rebellion, and walked like someone who had seen love and loss and chosen to wear both as armor. The strokes came quietly, small at first, a tremor in the hand, a forgotten name, then larger, collapsing lungs, failing organs, and still, she refused to let anyone see her weep, because if she cried, she'd admit it had all been for nothing. She asked for privacy, for time alone, but the press smelled decay. Cameras lingered outside hospital walls. Headlines predicted her end before her doctors did, and behind the walls of her Kensington apartment, she waited. For what? No one knew. Some said she was waiting for a final letter. Some believed she kept one photograph of Peter hidden in her drawer, the edges worn thin from decades of touch. Others said she stopped talking entirely for weeks, as if preserving her last breath for something or someone. And then, in February 2002, she died. Not in drama, not in scandal, just quietly, in her sleep, alone. The palace issued a statement. Polished, predictable. Her Royal Highness passed peacefully. The Queen wore black, bells tolled. But behind the mourning, behind the ceremony, there was a truth no one wanted to speak aloud. That Margaret didn't die of illness. She died of a broken heart. And somewhere, perhaps, the man who once made her feel real read the news and closed his eyes. Peter Townsend had outlived her, but he never replaced her. Because for all the rules the Crown could write, all the titles they could strip, and all the silence they could enforce, there was one truth they could never destroy. She loved him, always. And in the next chapter of her story, the world begins to ask, what if she hadn't given him up? What if the Queen had said yes? What if Princess Margaret had chosen love and walked away from the throne? What if one morning, instead of standing on the steps of Clarence House with that polished statement trembling in her throat, Margaret had torn off her gloves, thrown her pearls to the floor and chosen Peter, not the palace, not the church, not the line of succession, just him? What would her life have looked like? They moved to a quiet place, not too far, maybe Paris, maybe the countryside, a modest home with creaky stairs and wild gardens. She wakes up without duties, without the rigid calendar of obligations and expectation. She makes tea, writes, walks barefoot through grass, and at night she lies beside him, not as a symbol, not as a scandal, but as a woman in love. He touches her hand, not out of obligation but out of need, and she forgets what it was like to be watched. She begins to remember what it feels like to be wanted. In this world, they have children, not heirs, not responsibilities, but wild, laughing children who chase butterflies and know nothing of coronations. She reads to them at night, not decrees but stories, fairy tales, maybe, and when they ask about the tiara in the dusty box beneath the stairs, she just smiles. It's from another life, she tells them, a life where she wore gold and diamonds but not freedom. And yet, would that life have fulfilled her? Because as much as Margaret despised the constraints of the palace, it was part of her marrow, the drama, the ritual, the rhythm of duty. Could she really have walked away from all of it? Could she have lived in obscurity? Would she have become restless, bitter? Would the lack of ceremony feel like a loss or a liberation? There is another version of this story, the one the palace feared the most. The one where Margaret didn't vanish after choosing Peter. She became louder, bolder. The one where she held press conferences, defied the Queen, stood on stages and told the world, I choose love over legacy. The headlines would explode, the monarchy would shake, and perhaps she'd become more than a royal figurehead. She'd become a symbol, a woman who refused to be sacrificed on the altar of tradition. But in both versions, quiet exile or public rebellion, one thing is constant. She didn't die alone, and that truth haunted her. Because the real world wasn't built on what-ifs. It was built on silences, on sacrifices made in drawing rooms lit by chandeliers and whispered rules. The real Margaret sat in her royal apartment, year after year, with the ghost of a decision she couldn't undo. And maybe that's why she never burned the letters. They were tucked away carefully, deliberately, not in safes but in simple drawers. Some folded neatly, others frayed with time, all of them in Peter's hand. Simple ink, no seal, no signature of state, just words, soft, quiet, human. I miss you. I dreamed of your laughter. I saw your face today in the clouds. Margaret read them until her eyes blurred. She read them until the words no longer felt like sentences, but places she could crawl inside. When the world became too heavy, she opened one, just one, and remembered. She never told anyone about the final letter, not even her closest confidant, but the nurses said they saw her holding something the night before she died, clutching it, in fact, like a lifeline or a secret. She was always good at those secrets. Even when the scandals broke, her island trysts, the photographs with the younger man, the salacious headlines, there were still things the world never knew, like how, even in her wildest moments, she never removed Peter's ring from the small box in her dresser. Not the wedding ring, she never had that, but the one he gave her when he first said the word forever, a ring the palace made her return. But Margaret had one crafted in secret, identical, hidden from everyone, even the Queen, because some symbols aren't set for the public. There's a story one of her attendants told, long after Margaret's death, about a night when she'd had too much to drink, was ranting about Parliament, the church, the absurdity of smiling at men in sashes who smelled like dust. She raged, laughed, cried, and then suddenly she went quiet, stared into the fire and whispered, "He asked me to run, you know, just once, just once." The attendant asked what she said in return. Margaret didn't set answer. She just raised her glass and drank. But the look in her eyes said everything. She regretted it. Not all of it. Not the crown, not the honor, but the choice, the moment, the step she didn't take. That was the prison, not the palace, the past. She carried it like an heirloom, polished it in private, let no one touch it. And now, after death, it lingers. In the pages of books that never told her full story, in the interviews that sanitized her into sound bites, in the documentaries that focused on the scandal, not the soul. But she was more. She was a woman who dared to feel in a world that demanded silence, who burned too brightly in rooms that preferred shadows, who loved fully and was punished for it. But really, she was human, more than the crown ever let her be. And in the next breath of her story, as history moves forward without her, someone dares to ask, what if the royal family had changed for her instead? What if, just once, the system had bent for love? Because if they had, maybe she wouldn't be remembered as the princess who died for loving the wrong man. Maybe she would have been the queen of her own story. The Queen never spoke of it. Not in speeches, not in interviews, not even in the private letters she sent to friends overseas, written in that same perfectly measured hand she'd used since childhood. But silence doesn't mean forgetfulness. It wasn't a royal command. It was a sister's refusal. Quiet, steady, absolute. And it broke something. Elizabeth had always been the responsible one, the composed one. She knew the rules before she knew rebellion. Where Margaret flirted with chaos, Elizabeth lived in control, but that control had a cost. And no cost was heavier than the look Margaret gave her that afternoon in the garden at Windsor. The moment the words left Elizabeth's mouth and the sunlight caught her sister's face just long enough to show the fracture. "You, Esther, saying no," Margaret had said. "No title, no support, no compromise. You stir not just the Queen now, you stir the wall between me and the life I want." Elizabeth didn't start cry. She never cried in front of her, but her voice trembled just once when she replied, "I have to be." Years passed, decades, Margaret drifted further into scandal and secrecy, while Elizabeth anchored herself deeper into tradition. The older they grew, the more defined their roles became. One was the nation's moral spine, the other its guilty pleasure. And yet, every time Margaret's name appeared in the papers, every party, every photograph, every whispered affair, Elizabeth felt something rise in her chest. It wasn't stet embarrassment, because she knew, better than anyone, what Margaret had given up, what she had taken from her. There were moments, brief, unguarded moments, when the Queen would pause during state duties, and her gaze would linger on a passing couple in the crowd, a man reaching for a woman's hand, a laugh shared without cameras, a moment not dictated by press releases or tradition. And in those flickers of humanity, Elizabeth thought of Margaret, of what she never got. But monarchs don't apologize, not even to ghosts. So the guilt lived in quiet gestures. A larger budget for Margaret's wardrobe, passed discreetly. Invitations sent even when Margaret had insulted yet another diplomat at a private dinner, and in the end, a place at her funeral that felt more like confession than ceremony. But regret doesn't rewrite history, it just sharpens it. In the years after Margaret's death, Elizabeth spoke of her sister only in ceremonial tones, tributes, statements, public affection wrapped in royal plastic. But behind closed doors, the truth was less rehearsed. She was misunderstood, the Queen once told a former aide. But then so was I. Two sisters, one bound by duty, the other broken by it. They grew up in the same castle, wore the same ribbons in their hair, shared secrets under blankets during wartime raids. But the moment their father died, their fates split like lightning on stone. Elizabeth was crowned. Margaret was cornered. And no matter how many palaces Margaret danced through, or how many scandals she lit like matches just to feel alive, she never stopped wanting what her sister had. Not the crown, the freedom to live without it. And ironically, Elizabeth never stopped wondering what it would have felt like to be a little more like Margaret. To say no, to scream, to run. But it was too late for both of them. After Margaret's death, the halls of Kensington Palace grew quiet. Her apartments were sealed, her staff dismissed, her furniture catalogued like relics from a life no one quite knew how to honor. The tiaras went back to the vault. The letters, many of them, vanished into archives. And her laughter, once loud enough to drown out decorum, became a distant echo in rooms too polished for memory. Yet she lingered. In the eyes of Princess Diana, who smiled like Margaret, but wept like a girl who also wasn't allowed to love freely. In the posture of young Princess Margaret's nieces, who stood tall but wore something softer under their silence. And most of all, in the questions the press started asking again. Did the palace destroy her? Did tradition rob the world of a woman who could have been so much more than a supporting act? What if they had let her marry him? What if the monarchy had bent, just once? Would it still have stood, or would it have fallen? Elizabeth never answered that, not in words, but her actions spoke in volumes measured not by headlines, but by shifts. In the years following Margaret's passing, the royal family began to change. Divorce was no longer a disgrace. Marriages outside aristocracy no longer scandalized the crown. Prince Charles remarried, something Margaret was never allowed to do while keeping her place. Heirs married commoners. Rules once ironclad suddenly felt flexible. It was as if Margaret's life had been a warning, and her death, a reckoning. The palace realized too late. Breaking a woman to preserve an image only ends in shadows, and so they adapted, but not in time to save her. Margaret became the lesson the royals never wanted to learn but couldn't forget. And while her name faded from headlines, her story lingered. Because in every young woman forced to choose between love and expectation, in every sister who had to be the strong one, no matter the cost, in every heart that still asks, what if? Princess Margaret lives on, not as the scandal, not as the rebel, And in the next breath of this story, her memory will reach even further into the lives of women who came after her, some royal, some not, but all shaped by her impossible choice. Because once a woman breaks inside a golden cage, the sound echoes forever. The royal family never built monuments for her. No towering statue, no national holiday, just a plaque, a polished biography, and a long hallway in Kensington where her portrait still hangs, eyes half smiling, mouth slightly open, as if about to say something she never got the chance to. But Margaret didn't need a monument. She became a warning. And like all warnings, her presence lingered not in stone, but in blood. They saw her in the rules they were told not to question. They heard her in the way staff whispered, when one of them laughed too loudly or stood too close to the wrong man. They felt her in the stares of those who said, "A royal woman doesn't sit," but never finished the sentence. Because Margaret had already finished it for them. A royal woman doesn't love too much, doesn't live too openly, doesn't fight for something the crown hasn't pre-approved. And for a while they obeyed, until one girl didn't sit. She walked into the frame in the early 1980s, wide-eyed, soft-spoken, barely 20. They called her Diana. And in the beginning, they thought she was different, malleable, safe, the perfect bride, until she started speaking with her eyes the same way Margaret once did, until she started asking why. Why her husband Sid's heart wasn't Sid hers. Why the palace said duty when she said love. And behind the cameras, behind the waving hands and glass carriages, Margaret saw it, even in her own decay, even in her fading relevance. She saw it. The cycle was starting again, except this time, the girl was younger, and the stakes were higher, because Diana wasn't the sister of the monarch. She was the mother of the future king, and that terrified them. Margaret never said it publicly, but friends who visited her in her final years said she watched Diana on television with clenched hands, that she would sometimes mutter, "She sit'll never make it out, not whole." Because Margaret knew the cost. Diana did try to escape, and like Margaret she paid, with headlines, with betrayal, with silence louder than screams, and eventually with her life. And the monarchy, it kept walking, head high, smile frozen, but cracks had formed, deep ones, the kind that don't mend. And in those cracks, another woman arrived, American, divorced, actress, the kind of woman the royals once banished from their circles, the kind of woman Margaret was told she could never become. And suddenly, history wasn't repeating, it was colliding. Margaret's past, Diana's pain, Meghan's fury, all crashing into the same gilded walls. They tried to silence her too, with protocol, with quiet reminders of who she was supposed to be. She did what Margaret never could. She ran, with her prince, across oceans, away from palaces, towards something resembling peace. And yet, Margaret Sip's ghost followed her too, because even outside the palace, the scrutiny didn't stop, the judgment, the speculation, the dissecting of every word, every expression, every silence. Margaret knew that kind of pain. And now, inside those same royal walls, a new generation grows. Princess Charlotte, a child now, smiling for cameras, curtsying at events, learning early the choreography of being a Windsor. And one day, someone will tell her the story of the woman who came before, the one who laughed too loudly, loved too recklessly, and died too quietly. Margaret. And Charlotte, like every girl born into a legacy she didn't ask for, will wonder, was she brave or just broken? But the truth is, Margaret was both. She was the blueprint for every royal woman who wanted to be more than a silhouette in a tiara. She was the fire they tried to bury beneath marble floors and gold trim. She was the reason the palace eventually blinked. Because you can silence a woman, but you cannot silence her consequences. Margaret didn't set out to change anything. She just wanted to love, to feel, to be free. And in failing, she cracked open a door, just wide enough for those who came after her to step through it, to make louder choices, to demand softer lives, and maybe, just maybe, to rewrite the story. In the years since her death, the monarchy has softened, just enough, not entirely, but enough to let in a different kind of light. Enough to admit, in subtle gestures and changed policies, that maybe they were wrong. That maybe the princess who burned too brightly wasn't a disgrace. She was a warning bell. And now, as the world looks at the next generation, questions rise again. Will they remember her? Will they say her name in reverence? Or as a cautionary tale? The one who doesn't fit the frame. The one who speaks too loudly, feels too much, wants something more than being applauded from a distance. The one who gets labeled as trouble, when really she's the truth. And in the next chapter of this story, that truth refuses to stay buried. Because Margaret's voice, suppressed for decades, wasn't lost. It was waiting for someone to finally tell it. Long after the crowd stopped gathering, long after the flowers wilted outside the palace gates and the last tribute had aired on television, the doors to Margaret's private rooms were opened, not by the Queen, not by courtiers, but by silence. And silence, more than anyone, knows what people hide. The key wasn't in the obvious place, her jewelry box, her desk, the cabinet under the window. It was tucked inside a hollowed-out novel by Colette, a writer Margaret adored because she wrote women as wild and wounded. The pages had yellowed, the spine cracked, but inside the carved cavity, the key waited, small, silver, innocent. The drawer creaked when it opened. Inside were letters, dozens, some dated, some torn, some never finished, and none of them had ever been sent. The handwriting was unmistakable, sharp loops, impulsive flourishes, the unmistakable rhythm of a woman writing fast, as if the words were too heavy to carry much longer. They weren't addressed to Peter. They were addressed to herself. Each letter read like a confession, not for forgiveness, not for forgiveness, not for explanation, but for clarity, because when no one listens, the page becomes a mirror. Another simply said, "I miss who I was before they made me quiet. I used to dream of drowning in my own silk gowns," one began, "of smiling so hard my teeth cracked, of dancing until my ankles snapped, and no one would notice, because I would still be perfect." There were letters about her father, about how he smelled like tobacco and safety, about how, when he died, she stopped trusting clocks. "Time betrayed me," she wrote. "It took him, then it took everything else. She never meant to hurt me. That's what makes it worse." There were letters about Elizabeth too, some kind, some furious. Among the letters was a folder, thick, stained, tied with a ribbon that had long since faded from blue to grey. It was marked with a single word in capital letters: truth. And the most chilling of all, if I had said yes to Peter and no to her, would she have grieved me while I was still alive? Typed on yellowed paper, marked in red ink with edits, and written in the third person, as if Margaret couldn't bear to own the story with her name. But it was hers. There once was a girl born second, not in worth, but in order. She was raised to bow, to smile, to behave, but she wanted to burn. It began like this. The manuscript told everything, from childhood games with Elizabeth under staircase landings to the quiet war that began the day their roles split. It detailed her affair with Peter, every meeting, every letter, every moment of hesitation and breathless hope. She wrote about the Queen's refusal, not with cruelty but with a cold that seeped into the bones of the page. And then came the passages that didn't make it into official history. How she was monitored, how the press didn't find the scandals, they were fed them, how sometimes she wondered if the palace leaked stories just to keep her quiet, just to remind her who was in control. A memory of Peter reading her poetry while she lay barefoot on a hotel bed, her crown in a drawer, her guard down for once. A dream she had once of living in Italy, running a bookstore, No staff, no security, just coffee, laughter, and her own name on the lease. And in between the fury were soft moments. The manuscript wasn't set finished. The final page ended mid-sentence. And a recurring vision she had of walking into the sea until the water erased the sound of her name. If they ever tell my story, and then nothing. Just white space. The woman behind the crown was speaking, not to the public, not to the press, but to time itself. It was never meant for publishing. That much was clear. There were notes in the margins written to herself. Too angry, too sad. Take this out if it gets read. But the rawness was undeniable. She didn't want to be remembered as the scandal, or the rebel, or even the romantic. She wanted to be remembered as the one who saw the cost, and paid it anyway. Enough to start rumors, enough to spark whispers in palace corridors, enough to make people wonder how many stories do we never hear because they were too real. Why didn't instead we listen to her while she was alive? Because that sips the tragedy, isn't it? Margaret never wanted the world to adore her. She wanted the world to see her. But the world prefers its princesses polished, predictable, frozen, not bleeding, and certainly not writing the truth. Now, decades later, those letters remain her true legacy. Not the gowns, not the scandals, not the photographs of her with cigarettes and tiaras. It sits the ink. And if the royal family ever truly wants to change, it won't be in crowns or ceremonies. It will be in the courage to say, we failed her. She deserved to be heard. And in the next chapter of this story, the silence begins to crack, not from within the palace, but from the outside world, as a new generation discovers Margaret's words and finally starts listening. They thought the story ended when the coffin was lowered, when the trumpet sounded, when the flag was folded and the statement read. But stories like hers don't die with the ceremony. They ferment, they scatter, they find new voices, new homes, new hearts that beat with the same quiet fury. Princess Margaret is no longer just a photograph in the royal archives. She lives in the daughter who says no for the first time to a family that's built its legacy on silence. She lives in the girl who wants something dangerous to be seen as she is, not as she's expected to be. Because Margaret was the first royal woman of her time to choose authenticity over obedience, even when the world punished her for it. And now, generations later, the punishment has lost its power. Women today carry the same fire, but they light it for others. They don't hide their heartbreak in locked drawers. They publish it. They sing it. They film it on their phones and post it in 30-second videos that reach millions. And in those flickers of light between laughter and tears, Margaret flickers too. They say she was born too soon, that if she had lived now, she wouldn't have had to choose. She could have loved Peter, married him, kept her title, worn the crown and the truth. But maybe she came exactly when she was meant to. Because someone had to fall first. Someone had to live the consequences, scream into the velvet walls, crack the foundation. It was in her refusal to pretend. Even when the world begged her to smile, she let her sorrow sit plainly on her face. Even when they gave her pearls, she chose cigarettes. She made discomfort royal. And today, the world is catching up. Across continents, girls read her quotes. They study her photos not as gossip but as history. They ask, why was she silenced? And then answer by refusing to be silent themselves. There are fan accounts, anonymous essays, stage plays. Even a podcast named after her famous line, I am deeply superficial, but underneath the irony, there's truth. She knew people didn't want to know the real her, so she gave them mirrors, cracked and glittering. And in those fragments, we see ourselves. It was lonely. She didn't burn down the palace. And in doing so, she became something even the monarchy couldn't contain, a symbol, not of scandal, of survival, of what it means to walk through a world built for someone else's comfort, and still insist on existing in your own skin. Even if that skin trembles, even if it breaks, even if, in the end, its six never fully understood. Maybe she just needed to be remembered. And now, for the first time since her voice was stilled, that memory is rising, not from the headlines, not from the tabloids, but from the mouths of women who've never worn crowns, but carry invisible weight just the same. And they are saying her name with something the palace never gave her: grace. There were no parades when she died, no soaring speeches, no final salute that matched the fire she carried. The flags hung low, the news anchors spoke gently, and the world moved on, just like they always do when a complicated woman finally goes quiet. But Margaret wasn't gone. Not really. She remained where the silence was deepest. In the long hallways of Windsor, where no one dared mention her name unless it was wrapped in regret. In the photo albums that skipped entire chapters of her life because they didn't fit the image. In the Queen's own eyes, older now, dimmer, where 1,000 things remained unsaid, even as time stole her chance to say them. Because how do you mourn a sister you both loved and betrayed? Elizabeth never answered that question. Not publicly, not even in the final years, when illness softened her schedule and reflection became harder to ignore. But staff close to her noticed subtle changes. She kept Margaret's chair in the drawing room, untouched. She reread old letters late at night. And once during an official briefing she paused for a long time when someone mentioned the word sacrifice. No one dared ask what she was thinking. But everyone felt the shadow move across her expression. Margaret's absence had become its own kind of presence. Not loud, not haunting, just there. A ghost made of choices. One archivist, years after both sisters had passed, recalled receiving a quiet order from within the palace: review all of Margaret's personal items and report what might be problematic. It was the same phrase they always used: problematic. A word that meant human, flawed, real. Just pages and pages of poetry. Some published, some scribbled in the margins of appointment books, some typed with titles like Unsent, What If I Had Run, The Crown and the Cage. And in one poem, just 4 lines long, the entire story collapsed into truth. I chose the silence over the scream. I wore the dress, lived the dream, but in the mirror where I slept, a girl I loved no longer wept. It was dated just 6 weeks before her death. Margaret hadn't just resigned herself to her fate. She had learned to live inside it, with irony, with elegance, with pain dressed in pearls. And yet, she remained a stranger to the history books. A footnote, a side plot in someone else's narrative, the one who lit the cigarette behind the Queen, the rebel, the complication. But now, years later, something is shifting. Filmmakers whisper about untold scripts, and every time a new royal woman steps into the spotlight, whether it's to marry, to walk away, or simply to exist, Margaret's story gets pulled forward like a thread that refuses to stay buried. Because she was the first. The first to say, no, I will not just smile and wave. The first to make headlines for feeling too much, instead of not enough. The first to show the world that a princess can bleed. She wasn't stat perfect. Not even close. She was sharp, unfiltered, sometimes cruel, often wounded. She said the wrong things, loved the wrong people, chose badly, hid behind bravado, used glamour as a weapon and laughter as armor. But she also loved deeply, laughed honestly. And for a while she made millions believe in the magic of someone who didn't quite belong, but stayed anyway. And that may be her greatest tragedy. That she stayed. Not because she had to, but because she hoped something might change. It didn't stit. And so she changed instead, into something colder, wilder, but still unforgettable. She became the kind of woman who walks into a room and changes the temperature. Not by design, just by being. And even in her lowest years, the ones filled with cigarettes and tabloids and aching joints, she remained what she had always been, unapologetically herself. That sip's rare, in royalty, in women, in life. And that sip's why her story still matters. Not because it sets dramatic, but because it sets unfinished. The world never gave Margaret her ending, so she left behind pieces, letters, photos, words no one was ready to read. But now they are. Now the world is listening, not to the crown, but to the girl beneath it, to the woman who whispered, "Let me be something more than a sister," in the background. Because Margaret Sit's version wasn't Sit polished. It was flawed, raw, heartbreaking. And maybe that Sip's what made it royal in the end. Not the bloodline, but the fact that she dared to feel everything, even when it nearly destroyed her. And in the next chapter of this story, we walk where she couldn't, into the ending she was denied, into the love she never got to keep, into the woman she might have become if the world had simply let her live. He was living in France by then, quietly, peacefully, a man who had once stood beside kings, now sitting at a worn table in a garden that bloomed more wildly than the lawns of Buckingham ever allowed. Peter Townsend didn't speak of her in interviews. He didn't publish memoirs, didn't chase cameras, but that didn't just mean he forgot. He never remarried, not in any way that mattered. He had a partner, yes, children, a life. But those close to him said his heart was never quite whole, that no matter how many years passed, he always paused when her name came up on the news, that even in sleep he would murmur the beginnings of her name. Bim, and stop. One of his sons once found him on the porch, just before sunset, holding a letter he never mailed. The handwriting was careful. The date was recent. To M, who I still dream of. And then nothing. He hadn't finished the sentence. Maybe he didn't need to. Because some stories don't require endings, only echoes. But there was one story, one that only surfaced years after both had passed, that refused to die. A rumor too delicate to be confirmed, too persistent to be dismissed. That they met again. Not decades ago, not when the press was still watching, but near the very end. The version most often told is this, that in the autumn of 1994, just after Margaret's first stroke, but before her public reclusion, she traveled quietly to France. It wasn't an official visit, no fanfare, no tiara, just a woman with dark glasses, a plain coat and one request: don't tell the Queen. She arrived by private arrangement, not by jet, not by motorcade, but through a favor from someone in the old government, someone who still remembered what it meant to keep a secret. And there, in a garden outside Paris, beneath the falling orange leaves, he was waiting, older, grayer, slower. Peter didn't speak right away. Neither did she. The silence stretched, soft as fog, until Margaret reached for his hand the way she used to, without asking, as if no time had passed, as if they hadn't both been reshaped by years, regrets and roles. He held her fingers, thin now, fragile. Still breaking the rules, he said, smiling. She didn't laugh. Still pretending we ever followed them, she whispered. He poured her tea. She poured her heart. And finally she asked him a question. Did I make the wrong choice? Peter didn't answer right away. He looked out at the trees, where the last of the sunlight was bleeding through the branches. You made the only one you were allowed to make, he said. She looked down at her lap. But not the one I wanted. He turned to her then. For the first time in decades, their eyes met, not across crowded rooms or in stolen photographs, but as they had all those years ago, with no title, no protocol, just truth. And then, softly, he said, "You were always what I wanted." It was the last thing he ever said to her. Because Margaret stood, kissed him once on the cheek, and walked away. She didn't look back. Some say she cried in the car. Others say she stared straight ahead, her hands trembling in her lap like they had when she first stepped onto royal stages. Either way, she never saw him again. Peter died 3 years later. Quietly, with no tabloid headlines, no royal statements, just a line in the newspapers. Group Captain Peter Townsend, former equerry to King George VI, has passed away. The world barely blinked. But inside her apartments, Margaret didn't leave her room for 2 days. Her staff was told she had a migraine, that she was exhausted, but when one maid entered quietly to bring her tea, she found the princess not in bed, but by the window staring at nothing. The teacup in her hand was empty, and on the floor beside her, a letter, crumpled, torn, its contents never revealed. But the maid caught one word before it was thrown in the fire. Goodbye. Margaret lived 6 more years, but something in her changed after that. She appeared less, smiled less. She stopped correcting people when they called her cold. She stopped trying to be more than what the world allowed. It was as if she had finally buried something, or someone. And maybe that's the part of the story we've never quite understood. That she wasn't set bitter because she lost him. She was bitter because she never let herself keep him. And that ache, that lifelong ache, is what makes her more than just another royal with a scandal and a headline. It makes her human. It makes her us. Because everyone has a Peter Townsend. The one that got away. The one we said no to because we thought we had to. Because the world asked it of us. Because we were too scared to choose ourselves. She was the face of that fear, but also in the end of that courage. She walked away, twice, and both times she paid for it. But in doing so, she left behind something stronger than any fairy tale love story. She left behind a map of what it means to survive your own silence, to carry a heart that was never quite allowed to beat fully, to age inside a dream that never came true and still keep your head high. She didn't win, but she didn't disappear either. And as we prepare to close her story, one final question still remains. Was that meeting real, or just a myth whispered by those who wanted her to have one last moment of peace? We may never know, but maybe, just maybe, she did find it. Not in the crown, not in the headlines, but in one last glance, one final touch, and the truth that even if history forgot, they remembered. They buried her with a pearl necklace. 3 strands, simple, elegant, the kind of royal detail the public expects, neat, symmetrical, silent. But there was something else beneath the silk lining of her coffin. A faded photograph, small, black and white, edges worn soft from decades of fingers and memory. It was him, Peter. No one ever claimed responsibility for placing it there. Not the palace, not her children, not the staff. But someone knew, someone remembered, and someone made sure that in the end he was with her, not in life, but in the stillness that follows it. Because sometimes love doesn't set win. It waits. And sometimes waiting becomes the most radical thing a heart can do. Margaret waited for approval, for freedom, for forgiveness. She never asked for but always carried the weight of, and yet in all her waiting, she never became small. She became sharper, stranger, more real than any version the palace could contain. And that's why, years later, we still whisper her name not as scandal, but as a kind of sacred rebellion, because she made mistakes out loud. She wore her heartbreak like a jewel. She stood in the margins of royal history and turned them into a throne of her own making. There was no national reckoning after her death, no institutional apology. But slowly, almost imperceptibly, the world began to change. Girls were taught that silence is not always golden, and love, the messy, inconvenient kind, was no longer something to be buried under protocol. It began with whispers, then books, then scripts, and then, one day a child asked her mother, why did the sad princess never get to marry the man she loved? And the mother, wiser now, braver, answered, because back then love wasn't set allowed to matter more than appearances, but because of her it does now. That's Sip's legacy. Not in marble, in memory. Margaret's life was not a perfect arc. It was jagged, uneven, full of broken glass and soft silk. She lived too loudly for the family that raised her. She loved too boldly for the church that judged her. She died too quietly for the world that once consumed her pain for entertainment. But maybe that sips how revolutions begin. Not with noise, with a woman who refuses to disappear. And so when you walk past the portraits in royal galleries and pause in front of hers, the one where she stares straight ahead, lips barely parted, eyes unknowable, remember this. She wasn't set just a princess. She was a survivor of her own story. A woman made of contradictions. A lesson wrapped in laughter and tragedy. A symbol of everything the crown couldn't control, and still couldn't sit erase. Because Margaret didn't set vanish, she became a mirror. For every girl who dared to love recklessly, for every sister who stood in the shadow of someone else's throne, for every woman who was told to sit still, be graceful, stay quiet, and didn't. She was flawed, brilliant, tired, bright, and in the end, unforgettable. So let them remember the scandals. Let them gossip about the cigarettes, the affairs, the jewels, the tantrums. Let them laugh at the stories, judge the mistakes, question the choices. But when the lights go out and the page turns, she loved. She never bowed. She was Margaret. If this story moved you, if you saw even a piece of yourself in her fire, then don't let her fade. Like, subscribe, and share her story. Because the world tried to forget her, but not here, not with us. This is the untold woman, and here she will always be remembered.